Thank you very much for thinking about this whole area of media and social media dimensions to Christian scandals. I want to say right at the outset, I'm not an expert on communications and social media. I have somebody within my team who leads our communications area. It's not my particular expertise. But at some level, I'm speaking to you from my experience of things that I've faced and have had to deal with. And I think anybody in leadership, either directly in their own organisations or because of their connections with other organisations, will have had to deal with some of these issues of scandals and abuse. So what I'm really trying to do is talk to you a little bit about my experience, what's happened, things that I've learned from it. I'm also very conscious that I'm speaking to you from the perspective of being a leader of an organisation, not from the perspective of being a victim. I think actually that's one of the real challenges in dealing with this area is that you have very different roles if you're leading an organisation from if you are a victim who has experienced abuse. And I think one of the fundamental challenges here is that people find it very difficult to separate out those different roles and how you have to act in regard to them. So it's absolutely right that we live in a culture which is increasingly concerned about abuse and of the impact that abuse has on victims. And it's absolutely right to want to support, help, care for victims who are deeply traumatised. The challenge when you're leading an organisation is that, in a sense, you have a slightly different role. You often have the task of seeking to determine what's happened, whether allegations of abuse are really true, how to respond to those. And you're not in the simplistic situation of being able to simply support victims. You're actually often dealing with both the victims and the alleged abuser. And that is a quite uncomfortable place to be, because you have to maintain some measure of objectivity as the organisation deals with what might be allegations of abuse. And I think very often you get caught in the social media world because of that position that you're in. And that makes it extremely difficult to engage. Sadly, we are in a culture in which there are increasing numbers of scandals in the Christian church that are being exposed of abuse that's taken place. Very often that is abuse that took place in the past. So historic abuse is being unearthed, but also present and recent abuse is emerging. Now I say sadly that's emerging. Actually, I think the bringing of light to truth on what happens is ultimately a good thing. We need to actually recognise the reality. And the truth is that Christian organisations in the past have suppressed the reality of abuse and have hidden it. Very often organisations, whether churches, ministries, denominations, have sought to protect their reputation rather than to care for victims and deal with perpetrators. They've either not wanted to deal with abuse, or they've wanted to hide abuse. They've wanted to shuffle off abusers into other jobs without anybody knowing, and they've wanted to essentially keep hidden the reality of what is happening. In a sense, that is true not just of churches, it's been certainly a bigger cultural phenomena across all kinds of institutions and sectors of society. So churches are not unique in this area, but of course we are people who are meant to have higher standards because of what we believe about how we should treat one another. So it's more shocking when it's in a church context, but here we are dealing with a much wider problem of abuse, how victims have not been taken seriously, and how reputation management has been the top line. And that's fed through into organisational communication, or more often than not, total non-communication about what has taken place. Within the broad world of the church, of course, much of that burst to the surface with the kind of child sex abuse allegations within the Catholic Church, which kind of surfaced, and then multiple victims came forward and began to speak of their experience. I think sadly and tragically, many evangelicals kind of looked at the Catholic Church and assumed that can't be us. we're different. And actually what's begun to happen is more and more cases of abuse occurring within the evangelical world being exposed. There's also been a widening understanding of what abuse is. So at the same time as there's been the exposure of abuse, actually there's been a widening of an understanding of what abuse is. So I think until fairly recently, with abuse, we largely focused on sexual abuse and maybe physical abuse. Those would have been the areas when a person was victimized and they were sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, physically harmed. And that's the category in which abuse sort of fell. I think there's been a wider recognition that abuse goes beyond those physical activities, and it's essentially into the area of bullying and harming people by the misuse of power, the way that they are treated and mistreated. So abuse has come to cover a much wider range of failed behaviours on the part of leaders. So it's not simply confined to those sexual, physical, maybe even financial areas, but actually the whole culture of leadership and the way leaders have treated people is now in the category of abuse. And social media has had a huge role to play in exposing abuse and bringing abuse to the wider public attention. Social media has given a means by which victims have been able to speak of their experiences. Social media has given a sort of a means by which victims can connect with one another, and they can say, I've experienced that as well, which builds up a picture of the scale of abuse that has happened. Social media has given victims a platform to demand action to be taken, and for others to then get behind that demand for action and to gain a wider support across society. And social media has been a means by which the ways that institutions and leaders have responded to abuse can be commented on and critiqued and questioned. And that's now happening all the time. Again, it's not just in Christian circles. Actually, in many ways, the Me Too movement is an exact example of that. As women who've experienced historic and present sexual harassment began to speak about their experiences, social media enabled sort of women from a wide variety of contexts and stages to begin to start saying, that was my experience as well. That person who treated me like this, you like this, treated me like this. And there was both, in a way, a community of victim support and also a demand for action to be taken. You can see the impact of social media and how it has led to action being taken. Some of you might have picked up on the report published into the Southern Baptist Convention this kind of week, which has exposed a whole history of a failure at the executive level to deal with allegations of abuse that have been raised. The report indicates a kind of a failure to listen to victims, a failure to protect churches from pastors and others who have been found responsible for abuse, often again out of a desire for protecting institutional reputation and to avoid liability of the organisation. And in many ways, that has been the result of a long-running social media campaign demanding that there be a proper investigation. And then the reality is kind of exposed. And that's just one of many examples. That just happens to be the latest, and it happens to be large scale, in which social media has contributed to the unearthing of abuse, procedures and practices and failings. And although that's very painful, I hope that in that instance, and indeed in many others, the positive recommendations that are made will lead to a better culture in the future. So actually the shining of that light begins to sort of highlight the need for proper procedures and policies to be put in place. In some ways, that's all by way of background. The reason why social media in particular is so significant in these kinds of issues is because of the very nature of what it is. Social media is basically public, so it's publicly available. In that sense, it is open. to all to engage in. Most forms of social media, certainly in relation to these kinds of claims, there is no form of editorial control on what appears. So it's, in a sense, uncensored. So you cannot, within sort of the social media world, institutions and organizations cannot suppress because it's not within their control to do so. And social media is essentially instant. In other words, communication can be made absolutely and instantly, which means that communication on social media is very often not thought through. It's immediate response. So those are the kind of the key features of social kind of media, and because of its reach, it is very easily capable of garnering groups who work together and stand together. It's a way of testing wider opinion and support. It becomes, in a sense, a form of permanent, constant democracy kind of operating through that forum. One of the consequences of that is in effect, social media very quickly, for those who are engaged in it, and I think lots of evangelical Christians are engaged in it because we've become social media savvy. We've used it and seen it as a good platform, therefore we're engaged with it. It very easily becomes the court of public opinion. It is, in effect, the virtual marketplace of ideas and opinions in our culture, and way bigger than any physical marketplace. And essentially, through social media, everybody is invited to be a member of the jury. It's essentially what social media does, particularly in relation to abuse allegations. It invites everybody to be the jury. It's kind of like a giant version of the O.J. Simpson trial running as kind of stuff appears and everybody's expected to respond and decide. But actually, as a jury, you're not expected to respond and decide at the end. You're expected to respond and decide at every moment that something new is said. So you've got this kind of, it's the court of public opinion and you are the kind of jury. It very easily leads to campaigns demanding that you indicate your opinion, and it's a vehicle for mass virtue signaling on the part of others. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. That's in a sense all by way of a little bit of background to the context in which we find ourselves. We talk a little bit about my experience of communications and sort of recent scandals. This is from my context, thinking about situations that you may not know about. I'll tell you a little bit about them. I don't do that because I want to be particularly interested in the details, but they're the context of what's taken place. I'm the leader of the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches. I'm our national director. We have 635 churches that are part of the FIEC. Rather like the Southern Baptists, our challenge is all of our churches are autonomous and we have no power over them. So we don't control them, we don't authorize ministry. Actually, issues of safeguarding, protecting against abuse, they're all actually issues for the individual local church. Actually, we're much less denominational than the Southern Baptists would be in terms of having policies. So our degree of control and responsibility for churches is relatively limited. The most that we can do is basically remove a church and say that they no longer belong to us. Or if we've got a minister who's chosen to be accredited, we can remove their accreditation. But we can't do more than that. And in a small number of instances, there are churches where people have been identified as sexual abusers. Generally, the church has dealt with that, and if they're registered or accredited by us, their accreditation is removed. So that's just a little bit of the context in which I'm kind of operating. I want to say right at the outset, I personally have never been accused of abuse. So I'm not coming to you from the perspective of someone where people have said, you are an abuser. In the way that you've kind of operated. I've been on the end of having to deal with allegations of abuse about other people, some of those within the context of the organisation, and sometimes helping those in different organisations. So that's been much more my experience. So it's not been about personal claims of abuse, it's about how organisations have dealt with issues of abuse and the social media impact that flows from that. There have been a number of significant things that I'm involved in within Britain. A couple of big scandals that have erupted. And they've not been really in my constituency, they've been in amongst the evangelical Anglicans. So I'm a free church group, but we've got good relationships with Anglicans, particularly those who would be more conservative evangelical Anglicans. They're a strong section of the British kind of evangelical scene. And just to put you in the picture, a lot of conservative evangelical Anglicans and Anglican leaders have come out of elite public schools. That's our kind of expensive fee-paying schools, coming from a quite high-class social background. And that's the result of a particular ministry that worked with young people and that over a period of about 60 years has been generating leaders, training them, and kind of encouraging them to go into Church of England ministry. So for example, John Stott was converted through Ewan camps before the Second World War, and a whole raft of senior leaders. That would be their background. And it's within the British scene, it's challenging because those leaders have in many ways been very faithful leaders, but because of English class issues, there are also those who are jealous of the position they have and who think that they have their position because of their social status and because of their social connections within this particular group. So there's all of those dynamics going on. Now, what's emerged is a pattern of serious abuse within that constituency in particular. So in the 1980s, there was a leader on the camps, in fact, the chair of their board, who was a very charismatic lawyer. And basically, he was involved in all of the camps, engaged in individual discipleship with kind of boys at a particular school, drew them into his home, and kind of, in a sense, took them under his wing. But in doing so, used that as an opportunity to abuse them appallingly. So basically, the nature of his abuse was kind of naked beating on the grounds that this would this was necessary to grow in discipleship and Christ-likeness. We're talking about people being caned 800 times. We're talking about kind of quite appalling physical abuse. And in the 1980s, that came out. One of the victims sort of attempted suicide, and that revealed the reality of what was going on. And effectively what happened is they conducted an internal investigation. They clearly knew that this was abuse, but it wasn't taken to the police despite the fact that it was kind of children under 18 who were being abused. And it was essentially hushed up. And the leader, this particular leader, resigned as chair of the board and was ultimately shipped out to Africa. And basically for 30 years it was kept quiet. And then eventually the story broke into the public kind of sphere. So you can imagine what that has created is an atmosphere in which there is an expectation of cover-up of an appalling abuse that took place that 30 years later kind of emerges. There's an ongoing inquiry into that by the Church of England. It's been going on for a number of years. It's so big, and it hasn't reported yet. It will look into the question of who knew what, when, who's responsible. Some of the key players, most of the key players are now dead because they're leaders who were there at the time. Obviously, there are kind of a number of victims. And what makes it even more complicated is some of the key leaders within the constituency, it turns out, were victims of this man. So what you've got are present leaders who are also, in fact, victims, which makes it very complicated. So that's a bit of background. That'll make sense for you when I talk about the situation that I've been involved in primarily. One of the key leaders within that constituency, a slightly younger man, but he became a very dominant figure within that world, was a man called Jonathan Fletcher, who was a vicar in London. And he was at the very heart of this camp network. His brother ran it. And he became a very significant figure in Church of England evangelicalism. And he controlled a lot of churches as to who they would appoint to be their vicar. So behind the scenes, he was a little bit of a kingmaker who kind of was able to make or break people's careers and the jobs that they would get. And one of the consequences of that was that, in a sense, you had to be in with him in order to get the top jobs. And there was very much a sense of he had an inner group of his boys, and then others were on the outside and didn't really belong into that inner group. So it was quite a controlling, self-promoting kind of group. And lots of people were unhappy with that generally because they'd fallen out with him or they weren't in his group. Again, it emerged a couple of years ago that actually he himself had been engaged in abusive practices, nowhere near as severe as those that were kind of engaged in by John Smythe, who was the leader of Ewan. But in his discipling relationships, in his small groups, two things were basically going on. Firstly, he was grooming men to engage in naked massage with him. So he'd have a pattern of kind of getting to build relationships with young men. Then it would be going to the sports club. Then it would be having naked showers after sport. Then it would be suggestions of naked massage. Go from there. And there was also within small group discipleship that he set up, he also instituted a much lesser element of kind of beating or smacking each other as a kind of a penalty for failure in sin. So, they'd be sharing their sins, their temptations, their failings, and he called it a light-hearted forfeit system, but it was basically a form of beating. And actually, in both cases, what was really going on is a whole level of suppressed, sadistic, masochistic, homosexual practice that was taking part. Now, this burst onto the scene, and I think against the background of the previous case of massive suppression and hiding, the leaders had the question of how do we deal with these new allegations that have been made? And that's the point at which I got drawn in, basically because the Anglican leaders who were wanting to deal with that actually wanted somebody from outside to be part of the process of helping them to work it through, precisely because they wanted somebody who was not part of the system to make sure that it wasn't covered up. So they trusted me sufficiently to do that. I mean, a lot of them were friends, but I didn't really belong to their world, not in their churches. But I was asked to do that. And I basically only did that because my board and the chair of my board thought it was a right way for us to serve. So I knew I was stepping into something that would be controversial. So I didn't just simply say yes. I basically sort of spoke to my board. And actually the basis was, I said, well, I will tell you everything that's happening, because I don't want to be caught in a situation in which how this unfolds. I had no idea what the scale of anything was or what they would do or how it would be handled. But for the sake of the conservative British evangelical constituency, I thought it was important to help in that context. And out of that, the group, in a sense, came together to think about how to enable victims to come forward to discover the extent of what was going on, to commission a report into the church where he'd been so that that could be properly investigated. And also the other element was to, in a sense, tell the wider constituency what was happening. And there was a point at which it became clear there was a pattern of victims, there were more than were initially expected, and we, in the end, spoke to the constituency via a conference and then online and through other forms to say that this has all sort of become known, providing a counselling package for those who were victims, opportunity to come forwards, and taking the steps of an inquiry. So that is essentially what happened, and that was what was announced. Now, when all of that took place and when the report was commissioned, there were a group of people, not so much the victims, although sort of one or two victims, but actually others who'd been supporters of the victims, who basically concluded that there had been another cover-up that had taken place. So when the report was published, there were some who were dissatisfied with that report. And their basic kind of claim was, this is all just part of a cover-up, and you, the group, have suppressed the extent of what has taken place. The allegation was, in effect, that there were a whole load of people who were victims, who had been prevented from coming forward, or who had kind of been told to keep quiet for the sake of the organisation, that power had been used, and that in effect this was a second cover-up, despite the fact that it was an independent agency that had conducted the report. So the suggestion is that this group of people was so powerful that they had effectively been able to minimise the scale of what was revealed and what took place. Now, part of the challenge with this is the review and its conclusions and its guidance sort of in a rather vague way suggested that there were some people who ought to consider their positions and resign as a result of their knowledge of how this man had behaved over his years of ministry. But it was one of those classic things where the report didn't say who or why, which basically then gave license for those people who had a grievance against various leaders to be saying, you've been told to resign, why haven't you? And it became a very, very difficult kind of context to kind of manage that. So there was a combination of things going on. There was abuse that had taken place, a background of a previous incident where there had been an appalling cover-up, a hostility towards a certain group of leaders because of the power they had and the positions they had, and an alienation from them, and essentially a kind of a claim that the scale of the abusing had been minimised for the sake of reputation and the protection of the ministry. That all effectively burst onto social media. The other strange factor behind that is lots of the evangelical Anglican leaders, whilst I say lots of evangelicals are on social media, they are not on social media. Ironically, most of them are not on Facebook, not on Twitter, don't write blogs. So I was the most publicly exposed person because I am on social media. So frankly, all of this wider constituency, which were unhappy with what happened, piled onto me. And effectively claimed you've been part of an abusive kind of cover-up of what had happened there. Now at that point you're in a really difficult position because none of them have been there and watched what's happened. None of them knows exactly what's been said, and you are in the position of being accused of something where how do you prove a negative? And there's also a whole load of things that you can't reveal which are confidential. So I knew some people were victims that I couldn't reveal they were victims, and people were being spoken about in ways that were basically untrue and that I knew was causing them immense harm because of their victim status. So at one level, that is what happened, and there was a sort of a reasonably sort of intense social media campaign from a relatively small number of people. And in a way, they were wanting to use me as a way to get to this kind of wider group. And for 18 months, it wasn't really particularly easy, basically because of these kind of claims that there was going to be a whole load of other stuff that would come out. Over time, that to some degree is dissipated. And it's actually dissipated because of, I think, probably a couple of factors. Firstly, it's dissipated because over time, new allegations have not emerged. So some of the things that were being claimed about, what had happened, the scale of abuse, what would emerge, thus far has not. And I was in a really difficult situation because I always said I can never know whether things have been suppressed or not. I'm not in possession of that knowledge. All I can say is I've not heard anything that has been suppressed. But here is a raft of kind of allegations of what's going to come out. And over a period of time, it hasn't emerged in the way that some said it would. That has slightly changed things. Another element is that some of the people who they were most criticising have in effect been forced to publicly acknowledge that they are victims themselves. Of course, that then has changed the nature of the debate because people who were being viciously criticised, when you discover that they are victims of some quite awful abuse, the sympathy for them to some extent changes. That again was a very significant, but actually it was immensely costly to them and their families to come public about things they didn't want to have to talk about. I saw that the social media campaigning forced them into a position that effectively re-victimized them. But if they hadn't done that, they would have actually been in a kind of a very difficult kind of situation. And I think for some of those engaging in social media as the righteous campaigners, they obviously didn't know that, but it did show me that people don't think about the effect of what they say. They don't sort of realise that people's jobs and futures and ministries are on the line, and there might be a whole load of things that are kind of more kind of complex. So those are the main things, and actually the other key thing that changed it was some of the victims came and spoke out and said, the way you are dealing with this is inappropriate. We don't think there's been a cover-up. In fact, we think you are misusing our victimhood to pursue your own agenda. And actually, it was the intervention of victims speaking for the leaders had a significant impact on changing that. So, and actually during that period of time, there was a raft of kind of fairly hostile social media posts and Twitter comments and things like that. And most of the time, I think I managed to respond, either not respond or respond reasonably. There were one or two moments where I think the instant nature of kind of social media and the sense of being mistreated meant I replied quickly, and I would have been more nuanced. I didn't say anything particularly outrageous, but there are points at which it wasn't a helpful response, but it was an immediate response of hurt to that, and I had to learn, in a sense, to restrain that. But there is that point at which the cumulative effect of people saying the same things again and again and getting it, you hold back, you hold back, you hold back. There's a point at which you just think, just need to say something for my own sanity's sake. But when I've done, I'm normally very careful on social media. I normally don't post without immediately. I normally read my tweets and Facebook messages again and again before I post them to try to make sure it's what I said. It's the one or two where you kind of instantly responded where I think actually it didn't help. So not dramatically. Sorry?
We've all done that.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of my kind of story there. That's with an organisation I was helping with. With my own organisation, we've had a couple of allegations of abuse that have been made against pastors or leaders. And those have generally been issues, they're not sexual, they're issues of spiritual abuse. Usually it's people disagreeing with a leadership and what it's done, claiming that a leadership has been controlling, claiming that somebody has been kind of mistreated by leaders, often those who've left a church. And because of the whole media sort of development of abuse, there's been a kind of a growing number of those. Some of them are legitimate, and some, there's a danger that for lots of people, they're re-articulating their experience of disagreement and hurt in the language of abuse, and you have to take that seriously. And we've had to learn to put in place processes to be able to properly investigate that. Where social media has been most difficult for us is where we've followed a process and where a judgment has been reached, but a person who says they were a victim doesn't agree with the decision. So we've had a couple of instances where kind of a person feels they've been mistreated in a church or by a leader, but very often when you look into the circumstances, it's a disagreement, or they've also considerably contributed to the breakdown of the relationship. This is not a pattern of coercive, controlling leadership. This is not an abuse situation. But because the victim who came to you because they wanted vindication, when the decision is that that is not what happened, actually what they do is they attack you in the process because they haven't got what they've wanted. And either they or their supporters will say the process is not adequate, you didn't talk to enough people, here are other people you could have talked about, you had a biased judgment. Even if you've acted in good faith, objectively, bringing people in, because inevitably they actually weren't open-minded to what the process ought to conclude. And then that becomes a kind of a campaign. And what they then latch onto is you are basically the same as other institutions that have covered up what's happened. So I can almost guarantee from about 3 people we will get this week, look at the Southern Baptist report and you're exactly the same in FIEC. Even though actually the Southern Baptist report is all about sexual abuse. It's not about kind of bullying or kind of strong leadership. It's about sort of, child abuse, sex abuse, harassment. But the people who want to attack the process who are unhappy will take that and say, as another group with autonomous churches that's not investigating properly, you're just like them. Whereas in actual fact, we've investigated cases and we have an appeals process for that. So there's quite an extensive process and an ability to bring in external people to investigate. And so that then just mounts on social media. And it becomes difficult because, of course, lots of other people listening in will believe what is said. by those who are speaking for victims. So you've got a whole body of people who, some of them don't trust you, some of them have got an agenda against you anyway, and a whole large number of them simply don't know the reality of what's taken place. And you can't tell them in a social media context. And so you're having to respond against that. I hope that's helpful as a kind of just a framework of the kinds of things that I've had to deal with. And they've been kind of issues in leadership that you never want and never expected and weren't at all prepared for. So from an institutional perspective, there's been both how do you communicate when allegations of abuse are made? In other words, somebody comes to you claiming abuse, and then that is out there on social media more widely. So everybody knows that somebody's making claims. How do you deal with that? And then how do you deal, so what communication do you make as an organisation when you have allegations? And how do you deal with the individuals who are on social media, who are responding to you, commenting, making comments, including you in their tweets? That's the kind of scenario that I think personally I've been attempting to navigate over this period. And I would think that that's actually going to become more the norm for an awful lot of leadership. One thing I've noticed through this period is that a large numbers of pastors and church leaders have basically withdrawn from social media. Social media used to be a really good way of communicating with leaders and pastors, with your ideas, your thoughts, your opinions. It's quite a good discussion forum. I've noticed within my own constituency, because I'm talking organisationally, but this could happen to just a pastor of a local church. It happens at a micro level. Quite a number have just simply walked away from social media because they've seen what it does. And what was a useful tool, they're now not using, which ironically then leaves the social media platform to those who are perhaps more aggressive and have an agenda. I've noticed what they do, it's not that they're not watching and following social media, they're just not participating on it at all. Because anything you say will get sort of feedback. And on the variety of these issues, because there are a relatively small number of people who take it upon themselves to be victims advocates, and we are the warriors revealing all of the abusive practices and structures that are here. And it becomes a relatively small group of people who basically take the lead and become the watch guardians of what's happening. Let me make a few comments about practicalities of where we go. Since I've talked generally and we haven't gone through the sheet in bits, but just some things here I think that are really important. It seems to me that social media is a good, and like everything in this way, it can be used well or it can be used badly. But I do welcome the ability of social media to enable abuse to be exposed and properly investigated. Although it can be a hostile environment and it can be very difficult and it can be painful to be on the receiving end of it, I think it's hugely important that victims have had that opportunity to be able to have their abuse recognised and to force institutions and organisations to take appropriate action. We shouldn't in the end be afraid of the truth and transparency. We do need to let the light shine into the reality of what has happened. So I don't want to blame social media and see it as being a bad thing because victims are able to use it. I think that defensive response of institutions that is actually we are concerned about our reputation and we wish this wasn't being revealed, that element of culture needs to be changed in terms of if something is being raised, victims have been hurt, we need to do what is right in that situation. So I think there's the positive power. We've talked a bit about the negative dangers, and I do think the danger on social media is the fact that everybody will speak without knowledge and without awareness, and perhaps without appreciation of what really needs to be done where allegations of abuse have occurred. And how you respond on social media will then be interpreted as whether you care about victims or not. And I think there is a large measure of collective virtue signalling that is involved in this. People want to support victims, and it's very easy to do that just by clicking a like or clicking a link, but not having any real appreciation of the difficulties of genuinely addressing the issue. There are people who make false allegations and false claims. That's also a reality. Interestingly, in Britain, you were talking about the kind of innocent until proven guilty thing. There was a massive scandal over an alleged abuser who claimed that he'd been abused by a paedophile ring of very important and powerful people. There'd been murders. And the police adopted a "we believe you" approach. And in the end, it turned out he was a fantasist, and kind of a whole load of people's lives were ruined. And the guy himself ended up being sent to prison for 8 years because he'd made all of these false allegations. So that people do make false allegations, and to simply take them at face value can be devastating to a whole load of people. And we've learnt that by experience. And some of what will be said on social media may well be false. And of course, people use social media to pursue their wider agendas. One of the things that's really disturbed me is that sometimes those who seem to be most speaking for victims, you sometimes feel they are using the victims to pursue another agenda that they have. Leaders they don't like, people that they want to be dethroned from power. And it's very hard sometimes to sort of know how to navigate as to whether people are genuinely caring about victims or whether a victim story supports a wider narrative. Advice for organisations facing accusations of abuse. At one level, I would say the most important thing is you've already got your procedures in place to deal with it. I think one of the consequences that we've discovered through this as an organisation is we didn't have clear procedures as to what should happen. How do you make an accusation? What evidence do you have to provide? Who investigates it? What steps? And you're really caught out if you haven't got a process for how to deal with it. At that point, you look as though you don't care and you don't know what to do. So the absence of process makes your engagement in communications on social media more difficult. If you have a robust process, at one level, I think you can then afford to be open and transparent. And maybe you then need to communicate as an institution. These issues have been raised. We have a procedure that is in place to deal with them. That procedure is being followed. We can't say more at this point. If you are aware of other allegations or there's information that you would like to bring to our attention or to the attention of an external third party, here is the place to contact. If you are a victim and you need help, here's a helpline that you can engage with. I kind of summarise briefly, but I think where you have a process institutionally, what you're then able to say is we take this really seriously and our robust process is being followed. And I think you then have to communicate, I'm sorry, but we can't tell you more than that, and you will need to wait for the outcome of the process. And at one point, you just have to keep communicating that same thing. There's a process being undertaken. When it's completed, we will publish it in full and tell you what the consequence, allow you to kind of know the outcome of that. But at this moment, actually, I can't tell you what's said, by who, what's coming in, what's engaged. That's to subvert the process. And a lot of people as I said, on social media, they want to know every step of what's happening along the way as it happens. It's kind of rather like kind of wanting kind of CNN coverage that, we see the war unfolding moment by moment. And institutionally, you just simply have to say, we have a sort of a process and justify that process. So keeping the world and the constituency aware of what's happening and the timescales and what's unfolding is, I think, really helpful in that process there. And then just at a personal level, if the institution or leaders involved in it are then getting flack on social media, I think it's just gentle, reasonable pushback that says the process is being followed. I can't say anything more at this point. That's the kind of the sort of response. Saying nothing is usually kind of a recipe for disaster. I think you have to acknowledge the seriousness of what's being raised and that you are dealing with it. You're not ignoring it. People need to know that you're taking it seriously. In terms of advice for leaders facing allegations of abuse, I've not experienced this, but if you are a leader who is being accused of being an abusive leader, I think social media is not the place to defend yourself and fight your case. That's the temptation, is to kind of use social media to be self-justifying and vindicating. Again, It comes down to the processes that your organisation or church has adopted. And I think at that point, actually your best approach is to submit yourself to those processes and simply say that you have done. These allegations have been made, and the organisation is conducting a proper investigation. I can't say anything else. But actually to try to fight your case on social media is, I think, very counterproductive. It's absolutely right to be able to say, I deny them, make clear that the process is going on there. But I think if you turn social media into the place where you're trying to court support, I think that's very unhelpful to everybody. So when dealing with allegations of abuse, which is a little bit more about what I've talked about, and you get flack for that, I think you have to just, in a sense, sometimes not respond at all. There's a place at which actually you're not being directly accused, and actually you don't fight every battle all the time. You on social media have to let an awful lot of it pass you by. I've had a policy in social media that I've never actually blocked people because I've never wanted to communicate that I don't listen to you and I don't care. There were some points in this where people were so offensive repeatedly that I blocked it, not because of them, but because of my own sake. It was too much of a temptation for me to have this stuff coming, and I knew that I would find it difficult to not reply in a way that was unhelpful. So there are a small number of people who, in the end, I blocked, basically because I didn't trust myself. It wasn't because of what they were saying, it was because of how I might respond to it. And I wanted the safety of that. It was also unhelpfully obsessing my mind and my time to have that there, and I needed the space from that. So again, I think just reasonable pushback and reassuring of the process, I think is the most that I can do. And then I think 4 is as sort of Christianity is in all our communications. Communication, and we speak, the Bible has a massive amount to say about speaking, how we use our words, the impact our words have. And actually, social media is simply just a vehicle in which our words come out and are heard by others. And I think, therefore, we need to recognise all the temptations of the misuse of speech and all the disciplines of how we should use speech. And that is just as applicable to everything we say on social media. In a sense, the deceit of social media is that I'm not speaking to a real person. And therefore, I'm not careful to think about how they will receive it, its tone, its impact. It kind of seems to be speaking into the ether. People speak on social media in a way that they would never speak to an individual face to face. In other words, on social media, you cause harm at a distance and you don't have to live with the consequences. And I think for those of us who are Christians, we need to remember it's real people that we're speaking to, and therefore we need to resist the temptations of misspeaking, speaking hurtfully, sinfully, and to work on the disciplines of grace, truth, gentleness that ought to shape all of our speaking. But those often get lost, particularly in the social media world.